The vast galaxy was home to countless worlds, each with its own strange wonders, but among them there was one name that echoed in the halls of power: the Alien Queen. Her reign stretched across planets, her influence touching every corner of the universe. To her people, she was more than a ruler, she was a symbol of strength and order. Her cold, calculating mind had guided her species through countless wars and political upheavals. Her enemies feared her, and her allies respected her with unwavering loyalty. There was no room for weakness, and she had long since hardened herself to the demands of her empire. The Alien Queen's appearance was just as commanding as her reputation. Tall, regal, and composed, her presence demanded attention. Her deep eyes held a wisdom and a burden only those in power could truly understand. The sleek armor she wore shimmered with intricate designs, reflecting the light of distant stars. She moved with the grace of someone who knew she was the center of attention, but her expression was always unreadable, making her seem distant and untouchable. She lived in the heart of her empire, surrounded by the finest warriors and diplomats, each sworn to protect her and her kingdom. But even in her fortress of strength, there was one thing that could make her pause. One thing that, for reasons she could not explain, stirred something deep inside her. It wasn't the threat of another uprising, nor the challenge of maintaining her empire's dominance. It was a name that for years she had hoped to forget. The name of a human soldier. This soldier was an unlikely figure in her mind. Humans were often seen as weak and fragile creatures, no match for the advanced alien species who ruled the galaxy. Yet there was something about this particular soldier that made him stand out. He wasn't like the other humans she had encountered. He was different, and she could not stop thinking about him. It had been years since their paths first crossed, but the memory of that fateful day was still vivid in her mind. The Queen had been leading an invasion on a small human colony, a mission that was supposed to be simple, swift, and decisive. But this human soldier, barely more than a young man at the time, had been unlike any opponent she had faced. He fought with a determination that defied the odds. His tactics were unpredictable, his bravery unmatched. He had single-handedly led his comrades to a victory that no one saw coming, causing her forces to retreat. She had underestimated him, and that was something the Queen rarely allowed to happen. The battle was over, but her thoughts had been consumed by this human soldier. She had tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just a fleeting encounter. But the feeling lingered. A sense of respect? Admiration? She wasn't sure. The warrior queen was used to being in control, used to being the one who instilled fear. And yet here was a human who made her question everything. The queen never expected to hear his name again. After all, humanity was just a minor threat in the grand scheme of her empire. But one day, as she sat in her council chambers discussing strategies for future conquests, she heard it. The name. The human soldier's name. It was spoken by one of her trusted generals, who was reporting on the latest intelligence about human resistance movements. His name is Captain James, the general had said, his voice steady as he looked over the reports. He's been leading the human forces in a series of successful counterattacks. The moment the name was spoken, the room fell silent. For just a fraction of a second, the Queen's face froze. Her eyes, which had always been a mirror of composure, were wide with something unspoken. Her body was still, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't move. She couldn't. No one in the room noticed the subtle change, the way the Queen's expression shifted from cold calculation to something almost personal. But in that moment, the Queen was no longer the ruler of the galaxy. She was just a woman, caught in the web of a memory she could not escape. Her mind raced as the memories of the battle flooded back to her. The soldier's eyes, filled with fierce determination, the way he had fought not just for survival but for something greater. He had defied her expectations. He had defied her. For a moment, she felt a strange warmth in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was fleeting, almost like a dream, but it was enough to throw her off balance. The Queen, who had prided herself on her ability to maintain control, suddenly felt uncertain. What was this feeling? Why had hearing his name affected her so? She quickly regained her composure, but the damage had been done. For the first time in a long time, she questioned herself. The name of this human soldier had shaken her to the core, and she couldn't understand why. Her advisors, who were none the wiser, continued to speak around her, discussing plans for the coming months. But her mind was far from the conversation. She found herself lost in thought, imagining what would have happened had she faced Captain James in that battle years ago. Would she have seen him as just another enemy to crush? Or had she, for the first time in her life, found someone who truly challenged her? As the meeting drew to a close, the Queen dismissed her generals, but she stayed behind, standing alone in the grand hall. The silence of the room felt suffocating, and she realized she was no longer certain of her next steps. The name Captain James echoed in her mind over and over again. She could not understand why his name had such power over her. But one thing was certain. This human soldier had somehow become a part of her world, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again. The Queen's mind drifted back to the day she had first encountered Captain James on the battlefield, the day that changed everything. It had been years ago, but the memories of that battle were as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. The Queen had been leading her army, a well-trained force of elite soldiers who had never known defeat. They had arrived at the human colony under the cover of darkness, ready to strike. It was supposed to be a quick operation, an easy victory. The humans would put up a small resistance, but they would crumble just like all the others before them. The Queen had no reason to expect anything different. But as the battle raged on, something started to shift. The humans fought with an intensity that was unlike anything the Queen had experienced. They were not just defending their homes, they were fighting for their lives, their future. The Queen's forces had pushed them back to the colony's last line of defense, but the humans didn't surrender. They stood their ground, fiercely. Among them was Captain James, a man who seemed to command the attention of every soldier around him. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but there was something about him that drew the Queen's gaze. His movements were sharp, decisive, as though he had studied every angle of the battle before it even began. She had heard whispers of his reputation, how he had led his troops with unwavering confidence and a tactical mind that often outsmarted his enemies. But until that moment, she had never seen it for herself. The Queen had watched him from a distance, her keen eyes tracking his every move. He wasn't afraid. He fought with a courage that was almost reckless, yet there was a method to his madness. He was a master of strategy, using the terrain to his advantage, pulling his soldiers into tight formations that seemed to confuse her forces. For a moment, it felt as if the Queen's own soldiers were losing their footing, uncertain of their next move. Then, just as the tide seemed to turn in favor of the humans, disaster struck for the Queen's army. One of her generals, overconfident and eager for victory, led a direct assault on Captain James's position. It was a critical mistake. The Queen had not ordered it, but the general went forward anyway, thinking that he could crush the humans in one fell swoop. Instead, it was the Queen's soldiers who were caught in a deadly trap. The humans had anticipated the move. They had set up a series of ambush points that the Queen's forces had failed to notice. Within moments, her general's squad was pinned down, surrounded by a storm of gunfire and explosions. It was chaos. The Queen watched in disbelief as her forces were pushed back, struggling to regroup. And there, in the middle of the battlefield, was Captain James, standing tall among the carnage, directing his soldiers with unshakable determination. It was then that the Queen saw it. She saw the leader that she had been searching for, someone who was able to rise above the chaos and lead his people with both strength and wisdom. She had to admit, if only to herself, that there was a part of her that admired him. In the heat of battle, the Queen was not known for her mercy, but this time something inside her stirred. She knew that the human soldier had done something no one else had ever done. He had made her question her own resolve. The battle continued for hours, but the Queen knew that it was only a matter of time before her forces would be forced to retreat. She could not allow her army to suffer any more losses. It was a difficult decision, but one that she had made time and again in her rule. She ordered the retreat, signaling her generals to pull back and regroup. As the Queen's forces withdrew, she couldn't stop thinking about Captain James. How had he managed to turn the battle in the humans' favor? How had a single man been able to command such strength from his soldiers? There was something about him that unsettled her. She had fought many battles, faced many enemies, but this human soldier, this man, had managed to leave an impression on her that no one else had. The Queen ordered her fleet to withdraw from the human colony, but she could not shake the feeling that this battle was far from over. There was something about Captain James that lingered in her thoughts, something that made her wonder if their paths would cross again. She had hoped that the battle would be the end of it, that it would be just another victory for her empire, another footnote in history, but instead, it felt like the beginning of something much larger, something she could not yet understand. Back in her private chambers, the Queen stood before a large map of the galaxy. Her fingers traced the path of her forces, moving across planets and systems with ease. But her mind was no longer focused on the expansion of her empire. Instead, she found herself thinking about the battle, the way Captain James had stood out among the chaos, the way his name had echoed in her mind ever since. As the days passed, the Queen found herself haunted by the memory of the human soldier. She had never experienced anything like this before. She was the Queen, the ruler of an empire, and yet here she was thinking about a soldier, a human soldier. It was both strange and unsettling. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had never truly encountered anyone like him. There was something in his eyes, something that made her think that he wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol of something greater. He fought for his people for a cause, and he was willing to sacrifice everything for it. And that, more than anything else, made the Queen pause. In that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. He wasn't just a soldier to defeat. He was a challenge to her very existence. As the Queen lay awake that night staring out at the stars, she wondered if she would ever see Captain James again. She hoped, deep down, that she wouldn't. But a part of her, a part she had long buried, knew that their paths would cross once more. And when that moment came, she was not sure if she would be ready. The days that followed the battle were filled with the usual tasks and decisions that came with ruling an empire. But for the Queen, nothing seemed the same. Her thoughts kept returning to Captain James. Every time she tried to focus on her duties, his face, his name, his presence kept creeping into her mind. She had seen many soldiers in her time, but none like him, and now he had become an enigma that she couldn't ignore. She had never felt so unsettled. The Queen had spent most of her life building a reputation as a fierce and unyielding leader. Her people revered her for her strength, and her enemies feared her for her ruthlessness. She had always been in control. She had never allowed herself to show weakness. But now, as she sat on her throne, she realized that something had changed within her. The memory of the battle, the courage of the human soldier, and the strange connection they had shared were eating away at her thoughts. She could not shake the feeling that she was losing something she had always taken for granted: her control. There were moments when she could almost hear his voice, as if he were speaking directly to her, challenging her, calling her into a battle she didn't know if she was ready to face. The Queen was not used to uncertainty. She was used to knowing exactly what needed to be done and executing it without hesitation. But with him, she found herself questioning everything. Why had she saved him that day? Why had she felt something stir within her when she watched him fight so fiercely for his people? Was it respect, admiration, or was it something deeper? She wasn't sure, and that terrified her. Her advisors noticed the change in her. The once indomitable Queen was now quiet and distant. They had seen her rule with confidence and precision, but now they saw a woman who seemed lost in thought. Some of her generals, who had always been loyal, began to worry. They knew something was off, but they didn't dare question her directly. The Queen's silence was more than just a momentary lapse, it was a shift, and they could sense it. One of her trusted generals, a seasoned warrior named Varric, finally spoke up one day in the war room. "My queen," he said cautiously, bowing his head in respect. "You seem distracted. There is talk among the troops. They are wondering if there is something more to this human soldier than we know." The queen's eyes narrowed, her sharp gaze fixing on Varric. "What do you mean?" she asked coldly, though she could feel the unease bubbling inside her. Varric hesitated but pressed on. "I have seen your reaction, my queen. When his name was spoken, it was as if something shifted in you. You are the ruler of the galaxy. You have never been moved by a single human before. But this one, he has clearly had an impact on you." The queen said nothing at first. She didn't want to admit that Varric was right. She had spent years building her empire, crushing all those who opposed her. And now, here was this one human soldier who had shaken her to her core. She felt vulnerable, something she had not felt in a long time, and that feeling made her angry. But she did not lash out at Varric. Instead, she took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table as she tried to calm her racing mind. "I am not like other rulers," she said slowly, her voice a little more controlled. "I do not let emotions cloud my judgment. This soldier, Captain James, is just one man. I will defeat him just like I have defeated others." Varric nodded, though he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Of course, my queen. But remember, there is no such thing as a single man in war. It is the soldiers around him, the ones he leads, who make the difference, and I fear that this soldier is not like the others." The queen met Varric's gaze, and for a moment they both stood there in silence. The weight of the truth hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The human soldier had changed something within her. The queen, who had always been so sure of herself, now felt a crack in her resolve. She had always believed that her people were the strongest, that her empire was unstoppable. But Captain James had shown her that there were forces she could not control. As the days went by, the queen's inner turmoil only grew. She couldn't stop thinking about him. She had spent so much time building her empire, making sure that nothing could stand in her way. But now she was beginning to question if all of that mattered. What was the point of ruling a galaxy if she didn't understand what drove her? What was the point of crushing her enemies if it left her feeling empty inside? The queen often found herself walking alone in the gardens of her palace, trying to find clarity. The vast gardens were a place of peace and solitude for her, a place where she could clear her mind away from the pressures of ruling. But even here, she couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted her. The memory of the soldier, his strength, his courage, it was all she could think about. In those quiet moments, the queen allowed herself to feel something she had long buried: doubt. Was she truly the unbreakable ruler she had always believed herself to be? Or had she become someone else? Someone who feared what might happen if she truly faced the human soldier in battle? The queen didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing: she could not continue like this. The next time she faced her generals, she would need to make a decision. Would she continue to hunt down Captain James, determined to defeat him once and for all? Or would she risk everything she had built, questioning her own empire, for the chance to understand what truly drew her to him? Her heart, once so steadfast, now beat with uncertainty, and that, more than anything, frightened her. It had been years since the queen had seen Captain James. She had tried to forget him, to move past the memory of that fateful battle. But the name of the soldier, the images of his courage, and the unexpected connection they shared had been impossible to erase. And now, the day had come when their paths would cross once more. The news came from one of her spies. Captain James, now a decorated leader of the human resistance, had made a name for himself in a distant region of the galaxy. He was leading a series of successful counterattacks against her empire, his forces growing in strength with every victory. The queen felt a mixture of emotions: anger, frustration, and even a small, unexpected sense of excitement. She had expected him to be defeated long ago. The human resistance had been small and disorganized, their forces no match for the might of her empire. But Captain James was different. His leadership had turned the tide, rallying the humans in a way she had not anticipated. He was a thorn in her side, a symbol of everything that threatened the control she had fought so hard to build. The Queen stood in the command center of her palace, staring at the holographic map of the galaxy. The markers indicating the human resistance were growing closer to her borders. She could no longer ignore them. She could no longer ignore him. Her generals gathered around her, waiting for orders, but the Queen's mind was elsewhere. She thought about the soldier, the way he had stood firm against her forces all those years ago. His determination, his fearlessness. It had made her question everything she believed. And now, here he was again, standing against her empire. It was time to face him. She knew the risk. Captain James and his people were no longer the underdogs they had once been. They were a serious threat, and the Queen could not afford to underestimate him again. But there was also a part of her that felt an undeniable pull toward him. She had seen his courage, his strength, and somehow that made her feel vulnerable. She hated that feeling. The Queen ordered her fleet to mobilize. It was time for the final confrontation. Meanwhile, Captain James was preparing for the battle ahead. He had heard of the Queen's approach, and he knew that this would be his greatest challenge. His forces had grown, but they were still outmatched by the Queen's empire. However, James had something the Queen did not: hope. The humans were fighting for their freedom, for their survival, and that gave them a strength that the Queen could not understand. As the two forces drew closer, the tension in the air was palpable. Captain James, unaware of the Queen's internal struggle, prepared for the battle of his life. He knew that defeating the Queen would not only mean victory for his people, but it would change the course of history. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and he could feel the weight of it with every breath. The time for talk was over. It was time to fight. The battle raged on as the Queen's fleet approached Captain James's position. The stars themselves seemed to tremble with the force of the impending clash. The Queen's heart pounded in her chest as she stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the holographic displays of the battlefield. Her mind was focused, her eyes sharp, but a part of her could not shake the strange sense of anticipation that had settled over her. Captain James's forces were holding their ground, fighting fiercely, but it was clear that they were outmatched. The Queen's fleet was far superior, and it was only a matter of time before they would be overwhelmed. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the humans did not surrender. They fought on, led by their captain, their symbol of hope. For the Queen, the moment of reckoning had come. She could feel the weight of it, the significance of what was about to happen. This was no longer just a battle for control of the galaxy. It was a battle for something deeper. A battle for her own soul, her own identity. And as much as she tried to suppress it, she knew that the outcome of this battle would determine more than just the future of her empire. It would determine the future of her heart. As the two forces collided, the Queen's eyes were fixed on the battlefield below. She had seen many battles in her time, but this one felt different. There was a sense of finality in the air, a sense that everything was about to change. Then, in the midst of the chaos, she saw him. Captain James, standing tall in the thick of the fighting, his eyes locked on hers. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The noise of the battle faded away, and all that remained was the connection between them. The Queen's heart skipped a beat as she looked into his eyes filled with determination, with defiance. Eyes that saw her not as an enemy, but as something more. The Queen felt a strange pull, an unexpected vulnerability, as she watched him. For the first time in her life, she was not the ruler of the galaxy. She was a woman, facing the man who had challenged everything she thought she knew. And in that moment, she knew that the outcome of this battle was not as important as what came next. With a single command, the Queen ordered her fleet to halt. The sounds of battle ceased, and silence descended over the battlefield. The soldiers on both sides looked at each other in confusion. unsure of what was happening. The Queen's eyes never left Captain James's. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They stood there, separated by the distance of the battlefield, but closer than ever before. And in that silence, the Queen made a choice. She stepped forward, moving toward the human soldier. The weight of her armor felt lighter with every step, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. She was no longer the queen of an empire. She was a woman standing before the one man who had made her question everything. Captain James didn't move, his eyes fixed on hers. And as the Queen reached him, she looked up into his face, her voice barely a whisper. "You have won," she said, her words carrying the weight of a decision that had been years in the making. "Not with force, but with something greater. And for that, I cannot fight you anymore." In that moment, the Queen knew that this was not the end of the battle. It was the beginning of something else. Something that would change both of their worlds forever.